Welcome to session 9 of Ugbs 204. Today we are going to talk about inflation, which is one of the more popular concepts in all of macroeconomics. So we are going to talk about the meaning of inflation and then how inflation is measured, the types of inflation, and the economic consequences of inflation. So at the end of this session, it is expected that you should be able to explain what inflation is and then identify the causes and the types. You should also be able to calculate the rate of inflation when we give you some CPI numbers. And then you should be able to explain the long-run relationship between money supply and inflation, and then also the economic cost of anticipated and unanticipated inflation. So for this session, the reading list for this section, first there's session 12.3 of the book by Abel, Bernanke, and Khrushchev, then Mankiw and Taylor, chapter 11, and then also Cooper and John, chapter 16. Now, we also need the three most recent monetary policy, the three most recent CPI releases from the Ghana Statistical Service. It's available at the link provided in which is provided in the slides. So if you click on the slides, it will take you to the page, the CPI releases page of the Ghana Statistical Service, and you'll be able to access the CPI. So download the three most recent ones, and we are going to use some of them in the calculation. Okay, so let's start with the meaning and the measurement of inflation. So what is inflation? In general, inflation occurs when the general level of prices is rising. So we say inflation refers to rising general level of prices. So note that inflation doesn't mean that the price of every single item is rising. It simply means that on average, prices are rising. Now, obviously, that means it's possible some prices are not rising. Some prices may be unchanged. Some prices may even be falling. But on average, prices are rising. Then we have inflation. Okay. Now, when the rate of inflation is falling, it doesn't mean that the prices are falling. It simply means that prices are rising at a slower pace. Okay, it's common to call that disinflation. So we have disinflation when the rate of inflation is positive, but it is falling. So for instance, if inflation rate falls from 19% to 15% to 10%, we say that the rate of inflation is falling. It means that the rate at which prices are rising is falling, not that prices are falling. The situation where prices are actually falling is called deflation. So you have deflation when the price level is actually falling. How do we calculate inflation? Well, inflation is commonly, that is, consumer inflation is commonly calculated using what we call the consumer price index. The consumer price index measures the cost of a market basket of consumers, the cost of market basket of goods and services that is typically consumed by urban consumers. So essentially, we fix a particular market basket and we try and then measure the changes in the prices of the same market basket over time. And then that will help us to calculate what we call the CPI. So once we have this CPI, the way we use the CPI to calculate inflation is simply that CPI in the current period times T minus the CPI in the previous period times T minus 1 divided by the CPI in period T minus 1 times 100. So to take an example, if you refer to the CPI release for May 2016, And then our goal is to calculate the rate of inflation for May 2016. Now, the rate of inflation for May 2016 is year on year. Now, it's the year on year for the month of May. What that means is that it is measuring the rate, the change in the price level between May 2015 and May 2016. That's why it is called year on year. Even though it's for the month of May, it is called year on year because we are looking at the 12 months between May 2015 and May 2016. That's how the inflation rate is calculated. So if applying our formula, the inflation rate for May 2015 is going to be the CPI for May 2016 minus the CPI for May 2015, which is the base period in this case, divided by the CPI in May 2015 times 100. So if you read the numbers from the CPI table from the press release, we realize that the CPI for May 2016 was 176.4, and for May 2015 is 148.4, and we divide by 148.4 and multiply by 100%, and that gives us 18.9%. So that's how the 18.9% inflation rate for May 2016 was calculated. Okay. So this is how the inflation rate is calculated using the CPI. Now, it's also common to hear core inflation and headline inflation. If you recall from sections 7 and 8, we spoke about the Monetary Policy Committee press statement of November 2015. And then when there was discussion about inflation, the committee made reference to core inflation. Now, we talk about core inflation versus headline inflation. Generally, the inflation rate that we just calculated from the CPI is called headline inflation. That's the inflation rate we calculate when we include all the items in the CPI. Now, for monetary policy purposes, however, the inflation rate that is commonly used is called core inflation. And core inflation is inflation rate we calculate using excluding two items that are particularly volatile. In other words, when we are calculating core inflation, we exclude the price of two main items, food and energy. Food and energy prices are known to be particularly volatile. So when we are calculating the rate of inflation, we exclude them. So when we calculate inflation this way, we are calculating core inflation. If we calculate inflation using all the items in the CPI, we are calculating headline inflation. So in the case of Ghana, however, the two items that we exclude from the calculation of the core inflation are energy and utilities. Because in Ghana, energy and utilities are known to be the items that are particularly volatile. So when we calculate core inflation, we look them. Core inflation is seen as a truer measure of underlying inflation, because when we exclude the items whose prices we know are very volatile and move a lot, it means that we are getting a truer sense. When we add energy and utilities, whose items move a lot, they understate the true sense of inflation. So we call that a measure of underlying inflation, and is a preferred measure of inflation for monetary authorities, like the Bank of Ghana. In general, why do people say inflation rate is low or high? Well, typically when inflation rate is single digit, that is less than 10%, is seen at low inflation. So single digit inflation is commonly termed as low inflation. And then inflation rate, when the inflation rate is double digit or triple digit, that is inflation rate between 10% and 99%, is called galloping inflation. And then when inflation rate is above 1,000%, we have hyperinflation. So A more recent example of hyperinflation happened in Zimbabwe, where inflation rate was running into millions %. And there's also more commonly referred to periods of hyperinflation occur in Germany after the World War. Now, we also like to make a distinction between anticipated and unanticipated inflation. Anticipated and unanticipated inflation. Now, unanticipated inflation is the deviation of inflation from our expectation. As all economic agents form expectation about what the inflation rate will be. So if I ask each one of you, what do you think the inflation rate will be today or tomorrow, or what will be the inflation rate at the end of the month, you may have a sense based on maybe the historical trend. So that is your anticipation, your expectation of inflation. Now, when the actual inflation turned out to be exactly what you expected, then we say that all the inflation was anticipated. Now, the difference between what you expected and what is actual is called the unanticipated inflation. So, for instance, if you think that because of what has happened in the past, you think that next month the rate of inflation will be 18%, and next month the rate of inflation turned out to be 25%, then that 25% has both anticipated and unanticipated. The anticipated component will be 18%. The unanticipated will be the extra 7% on top of what you anticipated. So that's the difference. The unanticipated inflation is the surprise element of the inflation. That's the difference between what we expected and what we did not expect. When the inflation rate is exactly what you expected, then it means that all the inflation rate is anticipated. Next, we move on to the two major types of inflation. And these types are identified by their causes. So we have two main types: cost push inflation and demand pull inflation. Cost push inflation and demand pull inflation. Now, cost push inflation results from shocks to the aggregate supply curve. So if the inflation is caused by shocks to factors of production or shift in the level of aggregate supply. So for instance, if there's shortage of food, that means that the supply of food reduces, and that pushes the price up. We are going to call that cost push. If there's an oil price shock, and because of that, businesses are not able to produce enough, and therefore it reduces supply and causes the price level to rise, we are going to call that cost push. So cost push inflation refers to inflation that are caused by shift in the aggregate supply curve. And the typical causes of cost push inflation will include increases in the wage rate, that is the factors of production, increases in the wage rate, or the oil price shock. The first major oil price shock, that's the 1973 oil price shock, was commonly cited to have led to cost push inflation. Now, in the case of Ghana, the 1983 drought is considered to have been one of the major factors that led to triple-digit inflation in 1983. So for that period, if you recall, there was drought, and then there was fire. So there was drought that led to fire, that led to destruction of a lot of farm harvest. So farm harvest, the food harvest, and harvest of other crops were not enough. That means that the supply will fall, and that pushes, so giving the demand, that the aggregate supply will fall, and giving aggregate demand, that will cause the price level to rise. We call that cost push. Now, demand pull inflation, on the other hand, is caused by shift in the aggregate demand curve. So you commonly hear people say, too much money chasing too few goods. So in that case, it means that there's an indication that too much money is causing the demand for goods and services to increase. That is shifting the aggregate demand curve to the right. And that tends to push price up. We call that demand pull. So the main difference is that cost push inflation results from shift in the aggregate supply curve. Demand pull inflation results from shift in the aggregate demand curve. Now, one of the most famous economists, called Milton Friedman, has a famous quote that says that inflation is almost always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. What he is suggesting is that in the long run, inflation is always caused by printing of money. That's what that statement is all about. And then when the central bank prints money, it means that more money will become available. People will try and demand more goods and services, and ultimately it's going to shift the aggregate demand curve, and that will cause the price level to rise. That is demand pull inflation. Okay, so now that we understand the causes of inflation, now we understand the meaning of inflation and the causes of inflation. So why is inflation always in the news? Why is it that whenever the inflation rate goes up, there's so much discussion and there's so much fear and panic? Why is it that politicians also hate inflation rate so much? So we are going to see the economic consequences of inflation. And the economic consequences of inflation, we are going to consider whether the inflation is anticipated or unanticipated. In general, it's seen that the cost of unanticipated inflation is a little bit higher than the cost of anticipated inflation. So you already explained what anticipated inflation is. Inflation rate that is consistent with our expectations. So what are the costs of anticipated inflation? In other words, assuming that we are expecting the inflation rate to be 20%, and the inflation rate turns out to be 20%, exactly what we expected. What are the costs of such inflation? Now, we identified two main costs of this inflation, and that is menu cost and shoe leather cost. Menu cost and shoe leather cost. Now, what is the shoe leather cost of inflation? Now, you realize that during periods where there's anticipated inflation, especially the high rates, it forces individuals to change their money holding behavior. We know that when inflation is high and if you keep hold of our money, it's going to lose value. So the way we respond, the way we behave as rational beings when inflation is high is to keep more of our money at the bank and then try to avoid the costs associated with that, our money losing value. But when we do that, it means that we have to go to the bank more times to withdraw. Now, literally, it means that it's going to cost us our shoe leather. Our shoe leather is going to wear out. And that's where the funny name shoe leather cost comes from. But essentially encapsulates all the costs associated with high inflation, which forces us to alter our optimal money holding behavior. That's going to impose a cost on us. And that is the shoe leather cost of inflation. Then the menu cost of inflation. Now, during periods of inflation, it means that we have to continuously change our prices. So when if the price level keeps changing, it means that if you run a restaurant or if you print catalogs or if you run a supermarket, you have to keep changing your prices. And changing your prices costs money. It's not free. If you have to print a catalog every month instead of every year, that's going to cost you extra money. If you run a restaurant and you have to keep changing your menu because prices are changing, that costs you money. And that's what we call the menu cost of inflation. So the cost of having to constantly change our prices during high inflation period is what we call the menu cost. So what about unanticipated inflation? Well, when you have unanticipated inflation, all the two main causes that we've identified, they will still apply. But in addition to them, there are also other costs. In particular, unanticipated inflation has the tendency to redistribute income. And this income redistribution usually goes from borrowers, it redistributes income from lenders to borrowers. So if there's inflation and you don't anticipate it, it means that you couldn't have planned for it if you were lending. So those who are owing, the value of what they have to repay reduces. That is a transfer, a redistribution of wealth from lenders to borrowers. Also, during periods of high inflation, people who are on fixed income tend to lose some value of their income. So it also leads to a redistribution from those on people on fixed income, people who pay fixed income, it leads to a redistribution from recipients of fixed income to people who pay this fixed income. Now, other causes of inflation include people spending time on speculative and unproductive activities. It's also a major cause of high unanticipated inflation. So instead of people engaging in productive investment activities, they will spend more time trying to speculate on what the inflation rate will be and what measures to put in order to avoid the cost. All these are major economic causes of inflation. So we are going to end here. This is going to be the end of our discussion on inflation. So just to summarize, we explained that inflation refers to general rise in the price level, and that deflation, which is the opposite of inflation, occurs when when the average level of prices are falling. We learned how to calculate the rate of inflation using the CPI. We also talked about the main types of inflation, demand pull and cost push. And then we've also explained the economic consequences of inflation. The main references, all the major textbooks for this class are important references for this session. So that will be it for this. I will see you in the next session. Thanks for watching.